What does a faction have to have?
They're usually striving for a goal, and that goal might be to keep the status quo. It might be to change the status quo. But there's got to be something that's kind of holding them together on it. One of the best ways to break up a faction that's trying to get to a goal is give them that goal. And then you see everyone come apart because, again, there's nothing to hold that group together anymore. What happens next? Are people still trying to hold on to power? And you get to see who just wants power and who actually just wanted the goal to make things better.
What kind of inspirations do you use when you're creating these factions?
I'm 60 and I've been writing for more than 30 years, or publishing for more than 30 years. I've been writing for basically probably 50 years. I've kind of absorbed so much information at this point in ways that stories play out, and also just reading history and watching TV, and the way that factions in human society are so ingrained almost into our DNA. I think even when people try to do the very simplistic good versus evil, you'll still see factions creep in there because it's just such a part of our sort of social conditioning as humans.
We see a lot of narratives that are good versus evil, the grey knights versus the white knights and all of this stuff. How do we ensure our factions are more nuanced, that they're not just caricatures of a good guys versus bad guys scenario, to make our world building a bit more interesting?
Yeah, I think that's something a lot of people have dealt with over the years in fiction, because you see a lot of the person who is either on the good side or the bad side suddenly discovering that there's a middle ground there. And that's a very common story. I think if you're, as a writer, when you're trying to come up with this stuff, one thing to think about is it's a great place to root out your own stereotypes and biases and prejudices and bigotry and things like that. It's like looking at what you're visualizing as the bad guy can tell you more about yourself than it will the character you're creating, and just your assumptions. And fantasy and science fiction are interesting places to explore that. You can say, well, think out of the box, which is really easy to say, but first you have to figure out where your box is and kind of explore your biases. I think nowadays, most people who are trying to write science fiction fantasy have heard about the idea of trying to stay away from making your world a monoculture, and which was originally that the idea of monocultures were sort of, you're trying to, particularly in TV science fiction and fantasy, you're trying to like explain this group. You've got 30 seconds to a minute to do it in the middle of your action story. Monoculture is a great way to sort of get across what these characters are going to be like and what they're doing. But in books, we have an unlimited budget, and we have hopefully a lot of time while we're writing them to really explore, and you can give the feel that your world is not a monoculture without having to go in a lot of detail. People don't need to have a description of every human culture on Earth to know that there's a bunch of them. There's ways that you can give that impression, because really, in a lot of ways, when you're telling, a modern fantasy novel, the idea of going into this world building where every inch of the world is just not feasible for a lot of people. You have to give the feel that stuff is out there, you have to give the feel that the world does not have boundaries, by simple things of not saying, well, this is the only thing in the world. And I think one of the keys to not having a monoculture is not closing off possibilities, not making blanket statements, and just by quick references, letting your reader know there are different factions out there are different groups out there are different cultures out there. You can do that just by having a character walk through a market and describe what's there. Oh, this came from this came from that. I mean, there's lots of little ways to do it that don't interrupt the flow of the story.
You can have different factions that are trying to achieve the same thing or almost the same thing, and they just have different methodologies, or they have different reasons that they want to achieve it. And that's a very nice way to break away from the kind of like one faction versus another faction in the good versus evil fight.
That they just want to do the same thing, but they want to do it in a different way. You can destroy a whole society by two groups that want to do the same thing, but in a different way.
Yeah, absolutely. Or two groups that both have the best intentions at heart, but they both think that something else is the best outcome. A lot of this comes down to, of course, belief and faith as well, not just religious belief, but all sorts of different beliefs and faiths.
Yes, exactly.
How complex and deep should your factions be?
I think just complex and deep enough to tell the story, because basically all the world building, everything should be in service to telling the story.